When people say there isn't a cartoon that does this, or there haven't been enough of these cartoons, more likely than not, they couldn't be farther from the truth. There is quite literally a cartoon for everything, whether it's from 2019 or 1919. As harebrained as it seems, there's a reason why people call the new decade's worth of animated media derivative. Considering how far back the history of the medium spans, there's pretty much so many cartoons worth looking at that get overlooked. Surprisingly, even if there is one view of it. So I wanted to start a series for cartoons like that, stuff that's worth talking about, but what might not sustain a modest discussion on their own. Each volume will contain 3 to 5 topics of discussion to review, and today we're covering some adaptational Canadian headliners for the former NBC Saturday morning block, Kubo. Starting off with Turbo Dogs. Turbo Dogs is definitely a show that existed at one point. That sounds like a knock against it, but it's not meant to be one. When I was trying to decide what should be the 4th entry in this video, this one was chosen with an unanimous after coming to eternal conflict in terms of featuring more notable series. This one's plenty notable, of course, but it sports a well-worn premise. You see, the main characters have rather subdued adventures designed around learning pro-social morals. Based on the children's book Racer Dogs, the series was co-produced with kids' book franchise ever. With this in mind, the series manages to balance its somewhat educational leanings with its desire to tell engaging stories. I couldn't tell you if this show fully stacks up to the Racer Dogs lore, but based off the bits and bobs I've seen, it does a solid job of keeping its lighthearted tone. I think despite its low-key nature, I'm still fairly fond of this one. I wouldn't clamor to watch it now, but I don't see it in a particularly negative light, despite its subtractive design elements. In general, Turbo Dogs is a more loose adaptation of the book. There's no set of characters or significant settings lifted directly from that text. Rather, it appears that the series' concepts are inspired by the book. There are definitely dogs that seem to be the basis for characters in the cartoon. As I said before, the tone seems to be more in line with the books, but the art is a fairly notable deviation. Being reinvented on a relatively lower TV CG budget, the show doesn't really stick to the more flat, graphic style of the books. The character design didn't turn out too bad, as they're still pretty cartoony even when they're emulating more concrete dog breeds, but the animation is a bit lacking. It's far from the worst, but it can trudge along in pacing at times. There was some effort put forth to make the characters a bit more bouncy and flexible, but the movement is still pretty stiff. The lip sync is functional, but it only really sticks in a loose sense. I noticed that one of the production companies behind Turbo Dogs also produced this monstrosity, and suddenly it becomes much easier to appreciate the show for what it tried to do artistically. The characters are pretty chill though, they're simple but sweet archetypes that hold up against these didactic stories. The lessons and thematic set presented throughout is pretty fitting, and consistent with a trope of dogs learning to race better through the power of friendship. A pretty standard adaptation.
We're a team with lots to share. It's not where we're going, it's how we're gonna get there. We can do it when we do it together. We can do it.
My Friend Rabbit. This series sticks out to me as the idealized Kubo original, soft and bouncy, but still wise and vivacious. This series is a direct translation of the book that shares the same name and recontextualizes its most basic tenets of friendship, perseverance, and integrity. The main duo continue to have lively adventures around the woods as they voraciously problem-solve and critically analyze tricky situations. The animation is fresh, lively, and the gold standard of puppet-rigged digital series for its time. As dumb as it sounds, I get excited seeing these guys in action. The movement design is exactly on point, and the movement cycles are a sight to behold. It's definitely my favorite part of the show. I used to follow one of the lead animators on DeviantArt, so I got to absorb a lot of the show-relevant materials, and needless to say, I gained a healthy appreciation for Flash's applications at the time. But of course, the best animation would crumble under substandard voice acting. While some of the character voiceover is fairly typical and probably what you'd expect when you identify a preschool series, the acting is pretty strong among the main cast. Coming from an era where Peter Oldring was still the Canadian man of 1001 voices, I do kind of look forward to hearing his rendition of Rabbit. I can't think of anyone that didn't give a compelling performance or didn't present a line read that wasn't in character. The general aesthetic and structure of the show is a well-oiled machine. I can't promise each adventure is as riveting as they'd be in other programs on this list, but I can say you'll at least enjoy the character work. As neutralizing as that pro-social label may seem, the substance of the lesson stands out, at least in a philosophical context. This world isn't overtly saccharine and fabricated, but it was sweetened a bit. I think outside of my positive experiences with it, it might not be of much value to whoever else stumbles upon it. It probably just looked like your average preschool cartoon, and it kind of was for its time, though I do value it a little bit more. And it definitely is a solid series that ages like fine wine today. If we're talking about more notable adaptations, though, one would probably look to Jacob Tutu. The namesake for the series, the eponymous kid who has to repeat his name to be heard even once gets founded, is limiting, as the franchise itself has only spanned an original trilogy of books and a prequel written posthumously. In spite of this show does a decent job at balancing style and substance. The art direction is nice and gives the cartoon a nice illustrated quality. You can tell they wanted to animate it in Flash, but still manages to sneak in some good wild takes here or there, without abusing the motion blur of the series that's still relatively cartoonish and open. The art and the stories work overtime to set an atmospheric vibe throughout. On surface level, the series just seems like it'd be a pretty faithful adaptation, with its major deviations overall contributing to its significance. A few of the stories themselves are direct adaptations of the books. The first episode is a condensed version of Jacob Tutu and the Hooded Fang, the first of the trilogy. The series throughout continues to adapt the literary stories, but mostly occupies its own headspace worth of animated canon. I do pay respect to the books, though. The series apparently has made a point to teach certain vocabulary words in episode a la Martha Speaks. This show is pretty immersive, but if there are any series that brings you right into the heart of the action, I'd have to nominate
Dragon sweet, he let me see the young prince, then the king made me a knight apprentice. With dragon's help, I'll be a knight someday.
Jane and the Dragon. This is by far one of the most masterful Kubo acquisitions, which makes it one of the most memorable flagship programs even far off into the future. This series is a groundbreaking adaptation of a series of books started in the late 80s, that of which involving the titled former lady-in-waiting turned knight and her 300-year-old fire-breathing lizard. Together they defend their home turf as they expand their horizons. What's not to talk about? I mean, where do I even start here? The motion-captured CG animation is solid, and all the modeling from the background design to the props to the character design is all really well articulated. Obviously, the premise doesn't give complete historical course, but the little artistic flourishes here and there do add to the series' authenticity. The musical score is also pretty damn good. It sucks you in tension. As I've previously expressed, this show was pretty boss back in the day, and it did break a few glass ceilings for its time. Its animation was standout even compared to full theatrical productions, and it was one of the first animated series to be presented in full high definition. Perhaps the most interesting milestone stems from its origins. It's said that the main reason for the book's existence came out of a desire to write, quote-unquote, a story about a girl who wanted to follow her dreams despite the expectations of her family and friends. He had a fan tell him about how she didn't like stories centered around fairies because, quote-unquote, the girls were wimps. In the sphere of the series, of course, the main characters are standout protagonists, but looking inwardly, you start to discover that title was not delivered in vain. There is some solid character growth overall between both Jane and Dragon. Overall, all of these are pretty well-rounded, as most of the Kubo acquisitions are, even if the animation or the subject matter won't stand the test of time. Their charm and appeal will keep them relevant for years as Kubo continues to march on.